The reunion. John adjusted his greasy overalls and sighed as the old clock on the wall struck midnight. Another long day fixing machines in his small garage, and all he had to show for it was aching hands and a quiet, empty house. He glanced at the flickering neon sign outside his window, its soft hum the only noise in the stillness of the night. This was his life now. Quiet, predictable, and lonely. Then came the knock. It wasn't the usual polite tap of a neighbor or a customer looking for help. This knock was deliberate, almost hesitant, as if the person on the other side wasn't sure they should be there at all. John froze. At this hour, who could it be? He moved cautiously to the door, wiping his hands on a rag. The porch light cast long shadows across the yard, making the figure on the other side appear otherworldly. When he opened the door, his breath caught in his throat. There she was, Elira. Her violet eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, just as he remembered. Her skin shimmered with a soft, silvery hue, and her long, dark hair framed a face that was both familiar and alien. She looked the same as she had 10 years ago, when she had disappeared from his life without a word. "John," she said, her voice soft but laced with urgency. "I came back for you." For a moment, John could only stare. He had dreamed of this moment countless times, imagining what he might say or do if he ever saw her again. But now that she was standing in front of him, he was speechless. You're alive," he finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper. She smiled faintly, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Yes, but I don't have much time. I need your help." John stepped back, still trying to process what was happening. "Help? Elira, where have you been? What's going on?" Elira glanced over her shoulder, her body tense. "I'll explain everything, but not here. They're coming." "Who's coming?" John asked, his heart beginning to race. She stepped inside, closing the door behind her. "There are people, dangerous people, who want me dead, and they won't hesitate to hurt you to get to me." John ran a hand through his hair, his mind spinning. He had so many questions. Why had she left all those years ago? Why was she back now? And who were these people she was running from? But before he could say anything, a low rumble shook the house. "What was that?" he asked, his eyes darting to the window. Elira's face grew pale. "They're here." The rumble grew louder, and a bright light filled the room as a spacecraft descended into the yard. John's stomach dropped. He had seen spaceships before, mostly during the brief time he had spent with Elira, but he had never been this close to one. The ship was sleek and menacing, its glowing engines casting eerie shadows on the ground. Elira grabbed his arm, her grip firm. "We have to go, John. Now." "Go? Go where?" he demanded. "I don't even know what's happening." "I'll explain everything," she promised, pulling him toward the back door. "But if we stay here, we're both dead." The urgency in her voice left no room for argument. John grabbed his jacket and followed her out into the night. The cold air bit at his skin as they ran toward a small clearing behind the house. Elira tapped a device on her wrist, and another ship, a smaller, sleeker one, materialized in front of them. "Get in," she said, her voice tight. John hesitated. "Elira, I need answers. Why are you here? Why now?" She turned to face him, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "Because I couldn't stay away any longer. Because I need you, John. And because you're the only one I can trust." Before he could respond, a loud explosion shook the ground, and the ship in the yard fired a warning shot into the sky. Elira shoved him toward the door of her ship. "Please, John. Trust me." Something in her voice, desperation, maybe even a hint of regret, made him move. He climbed into the ship, and Elira followed, sealing the door behind them. As the engines roared to life, John glanced out the window and saw figures emerging from the other ship, their weapons glowing ominously. Elira's hands flew over the controls, and the ship lifted off the ground. The figures fired at them, but Elira was too fast. The ship shot into the sky, leaving the attackers behind. John sank into the seat, his heart pounding. He turned to Elira, who was focused on the controls, her jaw set. "Elira," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos. "What have you gotten me into?" She glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "I'll tell you everything, John. But first, we need to survive the night." And with that, the ship disappeared into the stars, leaving John's old life and his quiet, predictable world behind. The chase begins. The hum of Elira's ship filled the cabin as it shot through the dark skies, leaving John's home. And the danger behind, far below. John sat in the co-pilot seat, his knuckles white as he gripped the armrests. He wasn't sure what was scarier, the fact that he had just left everything he knew behind, or the woman sitting next to him who had turned his quiet life upside down in a matter of minutes. "You're going to tell me everything now," John said, his voice sharper than he intended. "Who are they? What do they want? And why did you come back?" Elira didn't answer immediately. Her focus remained on the controls, her hands moving with practiced precision. The ship weaved through a maze of stars as the radar beeped an ominous warning. Something, or someone, was following them. "Elira," John snapped, his frustration boiling over. "They're bounty hunters," she said finally, her voice clipped. "Hired by my people to bring me back, dead or alive." John blinked. "Bounty hunters. What did you do?" Elira's jaw tightened. "I took something they want." "Something like what?" He pressed. "A weapon. A secret. What's worth putting both of our lives on the line?" Elira glanced at him, her violet eyes blazing with a mix of anger and something that looked like regret. "Something that could change everything. For my people, for the galaxy, for us." Before John could demand more, the ship shuddered violently, throwing him against the side of his seat. The radar screamed louder as a sleek, black spacecraft appeared behind them, its cannons glowing red. "They found us," Elira said grimly. She yanked the controls, and the ship dove sharply, skimming the upper atmosphere of a nearby planet. John's stomach lurched as the stars outside became a blur. The pursuing ship opened fire, and a volley of energy blasts streaked past them, missing by inches. "Can't this thing go any faster?" John yelled, gripping the seat as the ship banked hard to the right. "It's not about speed," Elira shot back. "It's about skill." She pulled the ship into a tight corkscrew maneuver, evading another barrage of fire. The black ship followed, relentless in its pursuit. John could feel the heat of the chase, the walls of the cabin vibrating with every near miss. "John, hold on to something," Elira warned. "Why?" Before he could finish, Elira hit a button on the console, and the ship suddenly flipped upside down, hurtling backward toward the enemy craft. For a terrifying moment, John thought they were about to collide, but Elira's ship narrowly missed, spinning past the black craft and diving into a dense asteroid field. "You're insane," John gasped, his heart pounding in his chest. "Maybe," Elira muttered, her hands flying over the controls. But it worked. The black ship hesitated, its pilot clearly not as confident in navigating the chaotic maze of spinning rocks. Elira seized the moment, weaving her way through the asteroids with a precision that left John both terrified and impressed. "Where did you learn to fly like this?" he asked, his voice shaking. Elira allowed herself a faint smile. "Remember when I told you I was just a diplomat? That wasn't the whole truth." John groaned. Of course it wasn't. The ship burst through the other side of the asteroid field, and for a brief moment, the radar went silent. Elira exhaled, her shoulders relaxing slightly. "We lost them," she said, her tone filled with relief. But the moment was short-lived. A new warning light blinked on the console, and Elira's expression darkened. "No, we didn't." John followed her gaze to the screen. A second ship, a larger one, was waiting for them just ahead. Its weapons were already aimed, and its message was clear: surrender or die. "Let me guess, John said dryly. More bounty hunters. Elira nodded, her eyes scanning the controls. And this one's better armed. What's the plan? He asked, trying to ignore the rising panic in his chest. Elira hesitated, her confidence wavering for the first time. I don't know. The larger ship fired, and Elira barely managed to roll out of the way. The blast grazed their hull, sending sparks flying across the console. Not to rush you, John said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. But now might be a good time to figure that out. Elira's hands hovered over the controls, her mind racing. Then an idea sparked. John, do you trust me? He stared at her. You're asking me that now? Do you? She repeated, her tone urgent. John swallowed hard. I guess I don't have much of a choice, do I? Elira smiled faintly. Good. She slammed her hand onto a lever, and the ship suddenly accelerated toward the larger craft. John's eyes widened in horror. What are you doing? Buying us time, Elira said, her voice steady. Hold on. As the enemy ship loomed closer, Elira fired a pair of decoy drones. The tiny devices zipped toward the larger ship, their signals mimicking the energy signature of Elira's vessel. The enemy ship's weapons locked onto the decoys and fired, creating a blinding explosion. Elira used the distraction to dive toward the planet below. The ship shook violently as it entered the atmosphere, flames licking at the edges of the hull. John gritted his teeth, gripping the seat as the ground rushed toward them. We're not going to make it, he said. Elira's eyes burned with determination. Yes, we will. With a deafening roar, the ship crashed into the dense forest, skidding to a halt amid broken trees and smoking wreckage. The cabin filled with silence, broken only by the sound of John's ragged breathing. Elira unbuckled her harness, wincing as she stood. We need to move. They'll be here soon. John stared at her, his mind reeling. You're serious. After all that, you still think they'll come? Elira met his gaze, her expression unreadable. They won't stop, John. Not until they have what I took. And what exactly is that? He demanded. She hesitated, then said quietly, the truth. Before John could press her further, a distant rumble echoed through the forest. Elira's face hardened. Come on, we're not safe yet. John followed her into the shadows of the trees, realizing that his life, whatever it had been, was now far behind him. Stranded together, the forest was eerily quiet, save for the distant sound of crackling flames from a crashed ship. Thick, towering trees with glowing, bioluminescent leaves loomed over John and Elira as they trudged through the dense underbrush. The air smelled faintly of burned metal and damp earth. John stumbled over a root, muttering under his breath as he tried to keep up with Elira. We can't just keep walking, he said, wiping sweat from his forehead. We need a plan. And maybe a break, or I don't know, some answers. Elira didn't look back. Her violet eyes scanned the forest ahead, her body tense and alert. We don't have time for a break. They'll track the ship soon, if they haven't already. We need distance between us and the crash site. John stopped in his tracks, throwing up his hands. And then what? We run forever. Elira, I need to know what's going on. Why are they after you? What's this truth you keep talking about? Elira hesitated, her shoulders stiffening. She turned to face him, her expression unreadable in the dim light of the forest. It's not just about me, John. It's about my entire species. My people have been lying. To themselves, to the galaxy, for centuries. And I couldn't be a part of it anymore. What kind of lie are we talking about? John asked, crossing his arms. A little white lie, or the kind that gets bounty hunters shooting at us. Elira's lips pressed into a thin line, the kind that could collapse an empire. John stared at her, trying to process the weight of her words. Before he could respond, a rustling sound came from the trees above them. Elira's head snapped up, her hand instinctively going to the small weapon holstered at her side. What now? John whispered, his heart pounding. "Stay close," Elira murmured, pulling the weapon out. "And don't make any sudden moves." The rustling grew louder, and a shadow passed overhead. John craned his neck, squinting into the darkness. A creature, larger than anything he'd ever seen, was perched on one of the massive tree branches. Its glowing, six-eyed face stared down at them, its long, spindly limbs gripping the bark like claws. "Friend of yours?" John asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Elira didn't answer. The creature let out a low, guttural growl, its eyes narrowing. Then, without warning, it leaped from the branch, landing a few feet away. The ground shook under its weight. John stumbled backward, his hand instinctively going to the small multi-tool in his pocket. "Elira, I really hope that thing doesn't want to eat us." "Depends," Elira said, keeping her weapon trained on the creature. "If it thinks we're a threat, we're dinner. If we stay calm, it might lose interest." "Calm," John hissed. "It's the size of a house." The creature took a step closer, its nostrils flaring as it sniffed the air. Elira held her ground, her finger hovering over the trigger. "John, don't move." But as she spoke, the creature let out a deafening roar, its mouth opening to reveal rows of razor-sharp teeth. John flinched, instinctively stepping back, and onto a twig. The sharp crack echoed through the forest like a gunshot. The creature lunged. Elira fired, a bolt of blue energy striking the creature's side. It roared in pain but didn't slow down. Elira grabbed John's arm and pulled him into a sprint, dodging between trees as the creature gave chase. "This is not how I pictured my day ending," John shouted, his lungs burning. "Run faster." Elira snapped, weaving through the underbrush with practiced ease. The creature crashed through the forest behind them, its guttural growls sending birds and smaller animals scattering. Elira led them toward a rocky outcrop, ducking into a narrow crevice just as the creature's massive claws swiped at the air behind them. John squeezed in after her, his back pressed against the cold stone as the creature clawed at the entrance, unable to fit. "Is it gone?" John asked, his voice trembling. "Not yet," Elira whispered, her eyes locked on the entrance. "It's waiting. If we move, it'll strike." They stayed still, their breathing shallow. After what felt like an eternity, the creature let out a frustrated growl and lumbered away, the sound of its heavy footsteps fading into the distance. John slumped against the wall, his legs trembling. That was the single most terrifying thing I've ever experienced. Elira shot him a glance. "You get used to it." John glared at her. "I'm not sure I want to." Elira peered out of the crevice, ensuring the coast was clear before stepping out. "We need to keep moving. The longer we stay in one place, the more likely they'll find us." "Right," John muttered, following her. "Because this day couldn't possibly get worse." As they continued through the forest, Elira finally broke the silence. "The truth I stole, it's a data core. It contains records, histories, evidence of things my people have done. Things that were buried to protect the image of our empire." "Why would you take something like that?" John asked, his curiosity outweighing his exhaustion. Elira hesitated, then said quietly, "Because it wasn't right, and because I couldn't live with the lies anymore." John studied her, seeing a flicker of vulnerability beneath her stoic exterior. For the first time, he realized just how much she had sacrificed, not just for her people, but for him. She had risked everything to come back, to ask for his help. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You really know how to pick your battles, huh?" Elira gave him a faint smile. "You could say that." They pressed on, the glow of the forest lighting their path. Despite the danger, John couldn't shake the feeling that he was exactly where he was meant to be, by her side, for better or worse. The past revealed. The glow of the alien forest had dimmed into an eerie twilight by the time John and Elira found shelter in a shallow cave nestled between two jagged cliffs. The night was alive with sounds, strange creatures howling in the distance, leaves rustling in the wind, and the occasional sharp cry of something hunting. John's legs felt like jelly as he dropped onto the cool, damp ground, his back against the rocky wall. "We can't keep running forever," he said between ragged breaths. "We need a plan, Elira. Something that doesn't involve being eaten, shot, or crashing into another planet." Elira didn't respond immediately. She stood at the mouth of the cave, scanning the forest with her weapon in hand. Her silvery skin shimmered faintly in the dim light, her posture rigid with tension. Finally, she turned to face him, her violet eyes heavy with something John couldn't quite place: guilt, regret, or maybe both. "I owe you an explanation," she said softly. John raised an eyebrow. "You think?" Elira sat down across from him, her back to the wall. She stared at the ground for a moment, her fingers tracing the edge of her weapon. "Do you remember the last time we saw each other?" she asked. John's throat tightened. How could he forget? It had been 10 years, but the memory was as vivid as if it had happened yesterday. He nodded. "You left without a word. One day you were there, and the next, gone." Elira's gaze met his, and he saw a flicker of pain in her eyes. "I didn't have a choice." "There's always a choice," John said, his voice tinged with bitterness. "You could have said goodbye. Told me why." "I wanted to," she admitted. "But if I had, it would have put you in danger. More than you already were." John shook his head, the frustration bubbling to the surface. "Danger? Elira, I didn't even know what you were back then. You hid everything from me." "I was trying to protect you," she said, her voice rising. "You think I wanted to leave. You think it didn't tear me apart to walk away." The raw emotion in her voice caught John off guard. He stared at her, unsure of what to say. Elira took a deep breath, her hands clenching into fists. "The truth is, my people were watching me. They knew I was spending too much time on Earth, getting too close to you. They saw it as a weakness, a liability." "And you agreed with them?" John asked, his voice softer now. "No," she said firmly, "but they didn't give me a choice. They ordered me back, and if I refused, they would have killed you." John's chest tightened. "So you left to save me?" Elira nodded, her gaze dropping to the ground. "I thought it was the only way. But I never stopped thinking about you, John. Not for a single day." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The sounds of the forest filled the silence, a strange symphony of life on this alien world. Finally, John sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You could have told me the truth back then. Maybe I would have understood." "I didn't want to drag you into my world," Elira said. "But now, I've realized there's no escaping it. Not for me, and not for you." John leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "So what now? What are we really up against?" Elira hesitated, then pulled a small cube-shaped device from a pouch on her belt. It hummed softly in her hand, emitting a faint blue light. "This is what they want." John frowned. "What is it?" "It's a data core," Elira explained. "It contains records of everything my people have done to maintain their empire, every lie, every atrocity, every cover-up. It's proof that their entire system is built on corruption and bloodshed." John stared at the device, the weight of her words sinking in. "Why would you take something like that? Did you think you could change things?" "I had to try," she said. "I couldn't stand by and watch them destroy innocent lives for the sake of power. But now they'll stop at nothing to get it back. If this information gets out, it could bring down their entire government." "And what happens to you if that happens?" John asked quietly. Elira looked away. "I don't know. Maybe they'll kill me. Maybe I'll spend the rest of my life running. But it doesn't matter. The truth is more important than my life." John studied her, seeing the determination in her eyes. He had always admired her strength, her conviction. But now he saw the toll it had taken on her, the weight of carrying this burden alone. "I'm not sure if you're brave or just crazy," he said with a small smile. But either way, you're not doing this alone anymore. Elira's eyes softened. John. No, he said firmly. You came back for me, and now I'm here for you. Whatever happens next, we face it together. Elira nodded, a faint smile tugging at her lips. Thank you. Before either of them could say more, a distant noise echoed through the forest. It was faint but unmistakable, the hum of a spacecraft engine. They found us, Elira said, her voice tense. John stood, his muscles tensing. What's the plan? Elira rose to her feet, her weapon in hand. We move. Stay low, stay quiet, and hope they don't have ground troops. And if they do? John asked. Elira's gaze hardened. Then we fight. With that, they slipped out of the cave and into the shadows of the forest, their fates intertwined as the hunt continued. A desperate plan. The metallic clang of chains echoed through the cavernous interior of the alien ship. John sat slumped against the cold wall of his holding cell, his wrists bound with shimmering restraints that hummed faintly, suppressing even the smallest movements. Across from him, Elira sat upright, her head held high despite the restraints cutting into her silver-hued skin. Even now, she radiated defiance, though John could see the exhaustion etched in her face. Are you okay? John asked softly, his voice barely audible over the hum of the ship's engines. Elira glanced at him, her violet eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. I'm fine, she said, though her voice was laced with tension. You? I've had better days, he muttered. Being kidnapped by bounty hunters wasn't exactly on my to-do list. Elira almost smiled, but it quickly faded as the heavy footsteps of their captors approached. The door slid open, revealing a towering alien clad in sleek black armor, its face obscured by a helmet with a single glowing red visor. Two more guards flanked it, their weapons trained on John and Elira. You will come with us, the leader growled, its voice distorted and mechanical. Resistance will not be tolerated. John exchanged a glance with Elira. Friendly bunch, he murmured. Elira didn't respond. She stood slowly, her movements deliberate, and John followed her lead. The guards prodded them forward with their weapons, guiding them through a maze of corridors bathed in harsh, artificial light. The air was thick with the sterile smell of machinery and oil. Where are they taking us? John whispered. To the commander, Elira replied quietly. He'll want the data core. And if you don't give it to him, Elira's jaw tightened. Then things will get ugly. They were led into a vast chamber, its walls lined with monitors displaying streams of alien text and images of star systems. At the center of the room stood the commander, a hulking figure with an air of authority that made the guards seem small in comparison. His dark armor gleamed under the harsh lights, and his eyes, strange, pale slits, fixed on Elira with a chilling intensity. Elira Valen, the commander said, his voice deep and resonant, the traitor who thought she could defy the Empire. Elira met his gaze without flinching. If telling the truth makes me a traitor, so be it. The commander's lips curled into a cruel smile. You think your defiance is noble, but it's meaningless. Hand over the data core, and I may consider sparing your pathetic human companion. John stiffened, but Elira's voice was calm. You won't spare him, or me. You just want the core. The commander's smile faded. Then you leave me no choice. He motioned to one of the guards, who stepped forward and activated a device on Elira's restraints. A surge of electricity coursed through her body, and she fell to her knees with a sharp gasp. John surged forward instinctively, but the guards restrained him, shoving him back. Stop, John shouted, his voice echoing in the chamber. Leave her alone. The commander regarded him with mild interest. The human speaks. Curious. You want the core, don't you? John said, his mind racing. Then why torture her? You're wasting time. The commander tilted his head. Do you propose an alternative, human? John's heart pounded as he glanced at Elira, who shook her head subtly, warning him not to say more. But he couldn't just stand by. You need her alive to access the core, don't you? If you kill her, it's gone forever. The commander's pale eyes narrowed. What do you know of the core? Enough to know you're desperate to get it back, John said, trying to sound braver than he felt. So why not cut the theatrics and talk? Maybe we can work something out. Elira's eyes widened in disbelief, but John held her gaze, willing her to trust him. The commander chuckled, a low, menacing sound. You amuse me, human. Very well. I'll give you one chance to prove your worth. He gestured to the guards, who released Elira and John from their restraints, but kept their weapons trained on them. The commander leaned forward. You have 1 hour to convince her to give me the core. Fail, and you both die. Back in their cell, Elira paced the small space, her movements tense and agitated. What were you thinking? She hissed. You just made things worse. I bought us time, John said, sitting on the cold floor. That's more than we had before. Elira stopped pacing and glared at him. You don't understand what's at stake. If they get the core. They won't, John interrupted. Because you're going to activate it. Elira blinked. What? John leaned closer, lowering his voice. The core isn't just a storage device, is it? It's a weapon. Elira hesitated, then nodded. It has a failsafe. If activated, it emits an EMP strong enough to disable their ship. But it'll also destroy the core itself, and it could kill anyone in close proximity. John nodded, his mind racing. We can use it to escape. It's too risky, Elira said. You could die. I could die. And if we do nothing, we definitely will, John said firmly. Look, I know this isn't what you planned, but we're out of options. If we time it right, we can disable the ship and get out before they recover. Elira stared at him, her expression torn. Finally, she sighed. You're insane. Maybe, John said with a faint smile. But it's our best shot. She nodded reluctantly. Okay, let's do it. As they worked together to prepare their desperate plan, John couldn't help but marvel at the strange turn his life had taken. He was no hero, no fighter, but with Elira by his side, he felt like he could take on the galaxy. And he was ready to prove it. The escape. The hum of the alien ship's power core reverberated through the walls as John and Elira crouched in the shadows of the engine room. The faint glow of alien monitors cast an eerie green light, illuminating the sweat on John's brow as he fiddled with the device Elira had handed him, a compact, cylindrical tool that looked like something out of his wildest sci-fi dreams. Are you sure this is going to work? John whispered, glancing nervously at the doorway. The heavy footfalls of patrolling guards echoed faintly in the distance, each step a grim reminder of how little time they had. It has to, Elira replied, her voice steady but low. She crouched beside him, her violet eyes scanning the room for any sign of movement. The EMP in the core will disable the ship's systems, but only for a short time. We'll have maybe 5 minutes to get to the hangar and steal a shuttle before they recover. John let out a shaky breath, his fingers fumbling with the device. No pressure, then. Elira placed a hand on his arm, stopping his frantic movements. You can do this, John. I believe in you. He looked at her, surprised by the sincerity in her voice. For a moment, the weight of their predicament faded, replaced by the warmth of her gaze. He nodded, steeling himself. Okay, let's do this. Elira handed him the data core, its faint blue glow pulsing like a heartbeat. Insert this into the central console, she instructed. It'll trigger the EMP. Once it starts, we'll have to move fast. John swallowed hard and nodded. Got it. The engine room was a maze of pipes, glowing conduits, and alien machinery. John crept toward the central console, his every step measured and cautious. Elira followed a few paces behind, her weapon drawn and her eyes darting to every shadow. As they reached the console, Elira motioned for John to stop. She crouched beside a glowing panel, quickly overriding the security locks. The screen flashed, and the console powered up with a soft hum. "Now," she said, stepping aside. John stepped forward, his hands trembling slightly as he inserted the data core into the console. The device clicked into place, and the room was instantly bathed in a pulsing blue light. A low, resonant hum began to build, growing louder with each passing second. "EMP is charging," Elira said, her voice tense. "We've got less than a minute before it goes off." Suddenly, an alarm blared through the ship, its piercing wail cutting through the air. The monitors around them flickered, displaying alien text that John couldn't read but understood all too well. They'd been discovered. "Move," Elira shouted, grabbing his arm and pulling him toward the door. The corridors of the ship were alive with chaos. Red emergency lights flashed, and the sound of alien voices barking orders echoed from every direction. Guards flooded the hallways, their weapons drawn. But the EMP was already beginning to disrupt their systems. Sparks flew from malfunctioning panels, and the lights flickered erratically. Elira led the way, her movements swift and deliberate. John followed as best he could, his heart pounding in his chest. The ship's layout was a blur of identical corridors and metallic walls, but Elira navigated it with precision. "Hangars this way," she called over her shoulder. As they rounded a corner, 2 guards appeared, their weapons raised. Elira didn't hesitate. She fired twice, her shots precise and deadly. The guards dropped, and John stumbled to a halt, staring at their lifeless forms. "Keep moving," Elira snapped, pulling him forward. They burst into the hangar, a massive chamber filled with rows of sleek alien shuttles. The chaos of the EMP had reached its peak. Ships flickered in and out of power, and panicked crew members shouted as they tried to restore control. Elira scanned the room, her eyes locking onto a small, nimble-looking craft near the far end. "That one," she said, pointing. They sprinted toward the shuttle, weaving through the confusion. A group of guards spotted them and opened fire, their shots whizzing past. Elira returned fire, her aim deadly, while John ducked behind a cargo crate. "Go!" Elira shouted, covering him as he ran for the shuttle. John reached the craft and scrambled inside, his hands fumbling over the unfamiliar controls. "Elira, I don't know how to fly this thing." "I'll handle it," she yelled, firing one last shot before diving into the cockpit beside him. She slammed the hatch shut and powered up the ship. The engines roared to life, their hum cutting through the chaos outside. "Hang on," she said, gripping the controls. The shuttle lifted off the ground, its thrusters glowing brightly. Guards fired at them from below, but Elira maneuvered the craft with practiced ease, dodging their shots and accelerating toward the hangar doors. "Those doors aren't open," John shouted. "They will be," Elira replied, flipping a series of switches. The shuttle's weapons fired, blasting the doors apart in a shower of sparks. The craft shot through the opening and into the void of space, the ship's massive hull shrinking behind them. For a moment, John could hardly breathe, his chest heaving as he stared out at the stars. They had done it. They were free. But the moment of relief was short-lived. A warning light flashed on the console, and Elira's expression darkened. "They've launched fighters." John groaned. "Of course they have." Elira tightened her grip on the controls, her eyes blazing with determination. "Hold on, John. This isn't over yet." The shuttle banked hard, and the stars blurred as they dove into a high-speed chase through the void, the enemy fighters hot on their trail. Elira's hands moved like lightning, her every movement a calculated response to the pursuing ships. Despite the danger, John couldn't help but feel a strange sense of awe. Here he was, a mechanic from Earth, hurtling through space in a stolen alien shuttle with the woman he thought he'd lost forever. The odds were against them, but for the first time, he felt like they had a chance, and he wasn't going to waste it. Sacrifice and hope. The stolen shuttle hurtled through the void, its engines straining under Elira's relentless maneuvers. John clung to the edge of his seat as enemy fighters closed in, their weapons lighting up the blackness of space with bursts of deadly energy. "Elira, tell me you've got a plan," he shouted over the deafening alarms. "I always have a plan," she replied, her voice tight with focus. She spun the ship into a dizzying barrel roll, dodging another barrage of fire. The enemy fighters overshot their position, giving them a momentary reprieve. "That plan wouldn't involve dying, would it?" John asked, gripping the edge of the console. Elira didn't answer immediately. Her eyes flicked to the data core still embedded in the shuttle's control panel. The faint, steady pulse of blue light seemed to echo in her mind, reminding her of the choice she'd been avoiding. "There's only one way out of this," she said finally, her tone heavy. John frowned. "I don't like the sound of that." Elira adjusted the ship's trajectory, setting it on a collision course with the enemy frigate looming in the distance. The massive ship bristled with weapons and fighters, its menacing presence dominating the battlefield. Elira's hands moved deftly over the controls, rerouting power to the engines. "Wait a second," John said, his voice rising in panic. "What are you doing?" "Trust me, John," she said, her voice softer now. "I need you to get into the escape pod." John's heart sank. Escape pod. "Elira, no. Whatever you're planning, we can do it together." Her violet eyes met his, filled with a mixture of determination and sorrow. "This is the only way. The data core can emit a massive EMP, but I have to stay here to trigger it manually. If I don't, they'll catch us, and everything we've done will mean nothing." John shook his head, his hands balling into fists. "No, I'm not leaving you behind." "John," she said, stepping closer, "if they get that core, it's over. Not just for me, but for everyone they've oppressed. This is bigger than you and me." "I don't care about their war," John shouted, his voice cracking. "I care about you. I just got you back, Elira. I'm not losing you again." Her hand brushed his cheek, and for a moment, the chaos around them seemed to fade. "You won't lose me," she said softly. "You gave me a reason to fight, to believe that something better is possible. That's worth everything." John felt a lump rise in his throat. There has to be another way. But Elira had already made up her mind. She guided him toward the escape pod, her movements firm but gentle. "You have to live, John. You're the only one I trust to finish what we started." He looked at her, searching for the right words, but all he could manage was, "Elira, please." She leaned in, her forehead resting against his. "Thank you for reminding me what it means to care for someone. Now, go." The sound of the enemy fighters closing in snapped John out of his daze. With trembling hands, he climbed into the escape pod. Elira secured the hatch, her face the last thing he saw before the pod launched into the void. Through the small window of the escape pod, John watched as Elira's ship veered toward the enemy frigate. The pursuing fighters adjusted their course, focusing all their fire on the lone shuttle. The frigate's cannons glowed ominously as they prepared to obliterate her. "Come on, Elira," John whispered, his voice barely audible. Inside the shuttle, Elira's hands flew over the controls. The data core pulsed faster, its light growing brighter as she armed the EMP. The ship shuddered under the strain of enemy fire, warning lights flashing in every corner. Elira took a deep breath, her thoughts drifting to John. She pictured his face, his voice, the way he had looked at her with unwavering belief. For the first time, in a long time, she felt at peace. With a final press of a button, the data core activated. A blinding flash of blue light erupted from the shuttle, spreading outward in a wave of energy. The enemy frigate and its fleet of fighters were engulfed in the EMP, their systems shutting down instantly. The ships hung lifeless in space, their engines and weapons disabled. John shielded his eyes from the flash, his heart pounding as the shockwave rocked the escape pod. When the light faded, He searched the void for any sign of Elira's shuttle, but all he saw was debris and the hulking silhouettes of dead ships. "No," he whispered, his chest tightening. "No, no, no." The pod's navigation system activated, plotting a course toward a nearby planet. John sank into his seat, his mind numb as the pod carried him away from the battlefield. The escape pod landed on a lush green planet, its surface teeming with life. John stumbled out, his legs weak, and fell to his knees. He stared up at the sky, his vision blurred by tears. She was gone. She had saved him, saved everyone, but at the cost of her own life. As he sat there, the faint sound of beeping caught his attention. He turned to see the pod's monitor flashing. A message appeared in alien script, followed by a translation. "The fight isn't over. Keep the truth alive. Elira." John's breath hitched as he stared at the screen. A small compartment in the pod opened, revealing a backup copy of the data core, its faint blue glow a reminder of her sacrifice. He clenched his fists, his sorrow giving way to determination. Elira had given him a purpose, and he wouldn't let her down. Rising to his feet, he held the data core tightly. For Elira, for the galaxy, for hope, the fight was just beginning.